Welcome to today's edition of the Blazing Grace Show with Jason Graves and Mike Janung. Blazing Grace covers blazing issues with grace-filled answers. Here are your hosts, Jason and Mike.
Oh yes, another exciting edition of the Blazing Grace Show. This is Jason Graves along with Mike Janung. Hello, Michael.
Hey, Jason.
How are you?
I'm suffering. The Lakers have lost 6 in a row, and
oh, you poor thing.
What am I going to do with that?
I don't know. Maybe switch to the Clippers. Well, I tell you what, it's very interesting we're talking about suffering because that's the topic for the show today. And so you're asking, why would you be doing a show on suffering? Well, I think we can all relate to it in the first place, right? But we've got some stories to share around suffering. We want to certainly connect with you about those stories and certainly make more space for your own stories to be known in the places where you're able to share those things. And but also just look at how we can identify with Christ through suffering. So, Mike, I know that this is a unique time of year for you and your family and how that connects with suffering. So why don't you share about your own experience there?
Sure. March 11th, 1997, our second son, Scott, was born, and everything seemed to be going well with the birth, but then Michelle started having heavy bleeding during the contractions, and her placenta ruptured, and it wasn't too long before she started just turning white as a ghost, and she has some color to her skin, but they took her in for emergency C-section, and then Scott came out in a seizure. He wasn't breathing, and they tried to clear his lungs and still couldn't get him to breathe, and so then they put him on a ventilator, which did the breathing for him for the next 4 days, and basically found out that his cerebellum hadn't properly formed. And within 1 hour after Scott was born, a doctor walked up to me and said, "There's no hope for this baby." And I'm not a violent guy, but I just wanted to knock his teeth out right then and there. Right. I was so shocked. And then I ran into the truck and cried for about 15 minutes straight.
Right.
And after the 4th day, they said, "We need to see if he can breathe on his own." So they took him off the ventilator, and he breathed on his own for about a day. And then he was born on a Tuesday, and that Friday night I came home exhausted from the hospital. And then there's been a few times when God has really spoken clearly in my life, and the words came to me as clearly as anything: "Will you release him to me? Tomorrow you will have a choice to make." And I started crying, no, don't put that on me. I don't want that on me.
Right.
And then Saturday morning came. I'm getting ready to go to the hospital. Michelle calls. Scott had stopped breathing on his own, and they wanted a decision right then and there whether they should let him die or put him back on the ventilator. So then I knew that was God speaking the night before, and that was the choice he had for me to make. And so I told her, I think we need to let him go home. Rushed to the hospital, and Michelle and I held him while he died. And this is a boy who's basically brain dead.
Right.
And Michelle and I are crying and asking God for something, and he smiled. It was just the most amazing thing, and I just had this overwhelming sense that God was there in that room.
Right.
And then he died, and pretty much I was just broken for about a year after that.
Right.
There mornings I'd sit there, I just couldn't pray, couldn't read the Bible, just sat there and stared, and other mornings I'd be crying my eyes out. But today I can see that God used that in so many different ways, because I was a driven workaholic, and that really broke me of the idea that work could be a god or satisfy in any way, and it showed me the true value of my children and my wife. And I hate to say it, but about 6 months after that event, I acted out with porn. I was still struggling back at that time, and I'd always had this concept or hope that some big emotional traumatic event was going to cleanse me of that sin, but that doesn't happen.
Right.
But part of what I hope our listeners gain from today is that there is a blessing in suffering, and when we run from it, it's only going to make it worse.
Right.
So we have to face it, and we just had a birthday cake, March 11th, just a couple days ago for Scott, and my oldest son, Sean, was crying as we talked about what happened, but
Right.
You read in the Bible, there's a lot of people that are crying, suffering, going through tears, and they're expressing it.
So it's very healthy.
Right.
So Scott would be 7 or 8 today?
10.
10. Oh, okay. So this is 1997.
Right.
Okay. So 10 years old. So you have got 4 children, and certainly it'd be much different if you didn't have any children. But still, this is something that really affects your family. I mean, here's, your son now is 13?
12.
Yeah. Okay. So Sean's 12 years old. And he's still having this kind of reaction. So that just really speaks of the power that this has in your family still. And so how do you experience that on a day-to-day basis? I mean, how does that come to you? Because obviously it's not just a once-a-year thing. How does that touch your life week to week or month to month?
Well, around this time of the year, these feelings of grieving sometimes start to surface, and they can be strongest in the morning. And so what I do with them is I'll just go to God and I'll just be honest and I'll say, Lord, I grieve the loss of Scott today. And sometimes I'll write out the feelings in a journal. But basically I just talk with him, and I'll talk with Michelle, and, we'll just kind of maybe express our members, have some memories on what happened, and just kind of minister to each other in these moments. And,
right.
But also I go to the Lord with it, and I let him minister to me, because when I just go to him and be honest, I find that he comforts me, and I'm always reminded that Scott is in heaven. And without that hope, I don't know how people who aren't Christians deal with this stuff, because we would have been devastated beyond belief.
Yeah.
If it wasn't for that.
Yeah. I mean, I just picture myself in that situation, Mike, honestly, with here a 5-week-old little girl that we're just loving and adoring. Right before I came to the studio today, I was, kissing her face, and, I just think about me in that situation, and I don't know if I have suffered like that in my life. I mean, I think about that kind of suffering, and there's just something about family-related suffering that you could probably even say in your life, of all the suffering I've had, this really is distinct. So I bet you that there's people out there that really can connect with that and relate with family suffering, and the impression that it makes on your life.
Well, and we get plenty of emails from wives who are suffering and all this pain from the stuff their husbands are doing, and they're looking for a way out, and they're crying for somebody to talk to. And for me, when I was going through that, just having somebody I could talk to made such a difference.
Right.
And I know there are people who go through trauma like this, and they try and bottle it up and can it,
right,
stuff it, and that's the worst thing we can do.
Well, yeah, and that is such a common reaction. And I mean, did you have that reaction? Did you stuff it at all? Did you can it for a while, or was that foreign to your experience?
It was so overwhelming and powerful that I knew that if I even tried to do that, it just I'd go insane.
So you were lucky. You were pretty healthy when you went through this to a degree, to where you could talk about it, be open with it, and process it. But I mean, what do you say to the person that is stuffing it and is not looking at their suffering, and what do you say about the possible roots that they may need to look at about that, so that they don't have to stuff it anymore?
Well, I would say that first off, when we stuff, the problem is going to compound with interest. It's not going to go away.
Right.
So, I mean, even years past, we're still affected 10 years later by this. And somebody who stuffs it and grieves, I mean, basically you're cutting off a part of your heart. And we can't we're not robots.
Right.
God made us to express pain, to feel it. And when I was a sex addict, I can honestly say I tried to run from pain with everything I had.
Right.
I didn't want to experience that. I didn't want to feel depression. I was terrified of rejection.
Right.
So to the person who's going through suffering, I would say, we have to look back first at our family roots. How did our family communicate? And I have to be honest, my family didn't really talk about problems very often.
Right.
And, I mean, that's part of what we're here doing with this radio show on sex addiction, is encouraging people to be transparent and open with their brokenness.
Right.
So I would just say that, we're to restore one another in a spirit of gentleness, and we're supposed to weep with those who weep, and that's such a blessing.
Bear one another's burdens. Absolutely. I love, like, my men's group. I can just go dump on those guys, and I don't need to feel guilty about it, about taking the time up and everything. But it's so important for us to find a safe place to be able to do that, because there's all sorts of things that want to get in the way of us expressing what's in our heart. Fear of being judged. I can share about that when I talk about my suffering, but sometimes we are judged, but that doesn't mean we need to be afraid of it. Then there's other things like guilt, like, well, I'm taking up time here. I'm, talking about my stuff, and some people have a real hard time, or shame, things that the enemy has said to us that we've believed, that are lies that basically change who we think we are in the kingdom and in terms of our identity with God, being one of his children. We exchange the truth for a lie when we buy into that shame. So it's a lot there. Well, anything else that you want to say about your experience with suffering?
I remember that Chuck Swindoll said something years ago that I never forgot. He said, when God wants to use a man, he takes him and crushes him. And I remember always wanting to be used, but I really didn't want to be crushed.
Right.
But it's so true, because without that crushing, we still have that pride left intact, that I can do this on my own.
Right.
We still rely on our own strength. And God, there's so much that he's taught me more through the times of suffering than he ever has, or than I've ever seen through the times when things are going well and I'm not really connecting with him.
Right. Yeah, and there is such a danger in not being willing to be crushed, or not being in a position to be crushed, or just not being crushed, because if we do things on our own strength and in our own pride, I mean, we're missing out on the resources of the universe by partnering with the Lord of hosts and God, who wants to be in there for us and can make it so much better. But secondly is that, we often overestimate our own power and strength, don't we, in our pride. And so therefore, we're a little unstable. So yeah, important to be crushed, not fun or something we look forward to, but certainly it's a loving crush, isn't it?
Yeah.
Good. Well, listen, if you're just joining us, this is the Blazing Grace Show, and today Mike Janung and I are talking about the issue of suffering, and it's something that we can all kind of relate to as people in recovery, and addicts or co-addicts. People are in recovery alongside with an addict. But I want to share a little bit about my story with suffering as well, Mike, in just a second here. But just a quick announcement. We've got the first ever, hopefully annual, possibly last, Healing for the Soul reunion retreat. So we are going to be celebrating relationships, which is the theme here in Florissant, Colorado. It's about 45 minutes west of Colorado Springs in the beautiful mountains of the Rockies, and we're going to be getting together and having some workshops on relationships. We're going to be having some very relational healing worship time with counselors there that can pray with you, and we'll be talking on the theme of relationships. So if you want more information, you can go to healingforthesoul.org and click on the services tab, and the brochure is on the retreat page. So we'd love to have as many Blazing Grace listeners as possible. Come and join us May 18th through the 20th.
So is this for men and women?
Good question. I'm so glad you asked. It is for men and women. You can come as an individual or with your spouse. If you're single, if you're married, whatever. We've got room for everyone. So we've got Cisco Tercero, who is a acclaimed worship leader, going to be leading worship all weekend. And we're even going to have, unlike most retreats, we're going to have some downtime on Saturday, some time to go fly fishing or hiking, it's right next to the fossil beds up there in Florissant. So we're pretty excited about the range of activities there. So. And of course, baby Selah will be there to meet a lot of her honorary aunties and uncles. So we're pretty excited about that. But let me just share a little bit about my story with suffering, because Mike, when I hear your suffering, it's humbling. Because again, I really, for me, I think that would impact me more than anything I could ever imagine. I really can't imagine anything being harder to go through than with my family, my wife or my daughter. I mean, just devastating. But I know for me, there have been times in my life where the suffering has been very rich, very tangible, and something I did not enjoy at the time. But look back and see a lot of character from. And it has primarily to do with when I started to be really real about my struggle with primarily same-gender attractions. And I remember I was working as an intern in the youth ministry department at my home church back in the Seattle area. And I was getting my haircut one day and talking to my haircut guy who I'd known for years and was a good friend. He was talking about how he was a sex addict and how he's in a group for sex addicts. And I thought, wow, well, how interesting. I hadn't really heard of that before, but he was telling me about how he had all these rules and couldn't look at women and all this kind of stuff. I thought, wow, good for you. And I thought, well, it's interesting. I've struggled with a lot of the same things. His name is Patrick. But Patrick, my issue has really been more lust centered around guys, not gals. And so he said, well, glad you told me, you should really go and tell your pastor this. And so I thought, well, why not? I'm into being a transparent person, and my pastor was somebody I trusted implicitly. So I went and told him. He was a youth pastor, about a guy about my same age, and he said, wow, I'm so glad you told me. I never would have known that about you. Now, I was just telling him about my struggle, which was pretty much just in my mind, these feelings and thoughts that were unwanted. But hadn't ever acted out with another person in my adulthood and wasn't acting out with another person at that time. So he said, well, just to be on the safe side, let's go ahead and share this with the executive pastor of the church. Now, the executive pastor was the person who was in charge of all the other pastors. This was a big mega church, and there was probably, 30 pastors, right? And so this guy was my former college pastor, somebody who mentored my brother and somebody who I trusted. Told him about what was going on, and thought I was safe because I thought he was maybe in touch with his own struggle, which seemed to be something similar. And he said, well, okay, thanks for telling me. Never would have known that or guessed that. Let's go tell the team leader pastors. Now, the team leader pastors was a kind of a council of pastors who were the leaders of the other pastors. And so these were guys who were like my mentors and in the ministry, and their kids were in my youth groups. And so people that I, again, trusted really implicitly. Well, just to give you a little background, about 6 months prior to this, we had lost our only senior pastor of 25 years because he was being sexually inappropriate with young men. So every single night in the news, he was being flayed. Our church was being, just roasted. And he finally stepped down. So we had gotten this new pastor in. And I learned a lot about timing through this whole thing. I learned a lot about not casting my pearls before swines. But essentially what happened was I went into this room with him and these other team leader pastors.
All 30 of them?
No, there was 10 on the council, and they were the leaders of the 30 other pastors. And so 10 of them were there and shared with them what was going on. And they said, okay, well, why don't you step out and we'll just discuss this? And they had asked me a few questions. I went out there, half hour went by, hour went by. This whole time I was thinking, these guys are just going to give me some accountability, encourage me for doing the right thing by just being open about this, and give me some support that way. 2 hours went by, started to question that whole line of thinking. Went back in the room. They said, well, listen, you're describing an impurity, and here's what we're going to have you do. You're stepping down from all ministry. We're taking you off the payroll. You need to go to counseling every week. Now, I'd already been going to counseling with Joe Dallas. I had been going to an Exodus group. I had my life in the light, and I was working on this stuff. But they wanted me to go counseling with one of their pastors, and so I did that. You can't have any contact with children, which I'm not, really sure what that was about. And then they basically said, we'll reevaluate in 4 to 6 months. Well, I did everything that they asked me. It was very painful. I mean, the ministry was my life at this point. I was doing ministry, Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so to step away from this and to not be able to tell all the kids, there was hundreds of kids. I mean, we were having outreaches of 1,000 or more, and I was being able to speak at these outreaches. So I was very, had a lot of exposure, a lot of connections with these kids, and not being able to tell them why I was stepping down and having to kind of make up this vague, phony reason of, well, I'm just sort of burnt out. That was really hard. Then seeing the kids at church, but not being able to really talk with them, having to kind of keep my distance, was very painful. Not being able to really tell my friends or other people in the ministry really what was going on for me that was like, being almost invisible in my church.
Did you feel like an outcast?
I felt very much like an outcast, especially with these team leader pastors. I was very tempted to get bitter at them, but the whole time I just clung to the hope and the belief that God was going to make good on this and he was going to redeem it. But yeah, I did feel like an outcast when it came to these pastors, because 4 months went by, they didn't review. 5 months went by, they didn't review it. 6 months went by, I saw the writing on the wall, and I basically went and took a job in another state. So, it was painful, felt marginalized, but God has really used it for sure. When I see people who now feel very scared about being in the light with their stories, with anybody, I have a lot of confidence in being able to tell them, listen, you can be in the light with people, and it can get messy. It doesn't have to. But I have some wisdom to pass along, like don't throw your pearls before swines. You don't need to tell people who don't need to know certain things. But also, be careful about how you tell it. I wish I would have told those people from more of a position of strength and victory than a position of, boy, I'm just really struggling with this. Because at that point, I really was struggling with this. To this day, or at this point in my life, in this struggle, I can talk about it a whole lot differently. So, yeah, there's my suffering, all right? You have it, all right?
So from that furnace, looking back today, what can you say God did in your heart personally from it?
Great question. Number one, he affirmed me. He said, you know what? These men were just doing the best they could. They're broken human beings too, and they deal with things like fear. And they deal with things like judgmentalism. And they deal with things like ignorance. And I think there was a lot about their decision-making that had those influences in it. But God can still use that, and he affirmed me that I am the authority in your life. And these people, the only authority they have over you is because of me. So if you obey and if you apply yourself to what they give you, I'm going to bless your life because of it. And he has. Redemption. I mean, gosh. If I hadn't gone through that, I wouldn't have this story to tell. People need encouragement that people have been through these kinds of stories, because there's people in churches getting judged left and right. And my message to them is a message of hope, that look, it doesn't matter if you've been judged. Go to another church, or go back and reconcile with those people and say, hey, you know what? I think you could have done things a little different here. And I've tempted to do that as well.
How did you cope with the temptation to turn to bitterness or criticism or judging on them?
Well, that wasn't easy, because I come from a long line of championship grudge holders. Okay, so the Graves clan can hold a grudge like no one. All right, so I was really tempted to get bitter. And sure, did I take some distance from these people? Yeah, I did take a little healthy distance from them, but I didn't cut them off, and I didn't dwell on my anger towards them. Instead, I have prayed for them, I have approached them, and I've tried to direct the energies, any negative energies that I had, anger and whatnot, to something that's been reparative or redemptive or good. And so, now, these days, I'm doing counseling, I'm doing speaking, and I'm opening my mouth on the radio regularly here. So hopefully that's enough.
That's great, because isn't the temptation to go to judging, isn't that so subtle and so powerful and easy to fall into?
I think it is. And, there's a difference between making a judgment and being judgmental. It is important to make a right judgment, as the Bible calls us to be discerning. But when we take it one step further to say, I'm better than you because of this, that's called judgmentalism. All right? So there's a difference to be explored there. We just have a minute, but I just hope that this show is ministered to you today, because we can all connect to suffering. The wife, like you said earlier, Mike, who's out there, who needs answers because of her husband's acting out, who needs support, needs somebody to talk to, needs to trust and hope again. The addict who's just in the throes of this addiction. We want to help you. We hope that this has been support to you. But just remember that Jesus can redeem this suffering. And he has suffered more than the cumulative suffering of all mankind up on that cross. So we can identify with Jesus in our suffering. So embrace your suffering, and let's take it and move redemptively to the future. Next week, we're going to talk with Tom Pettigo, so make sure and tune in right here. This is the Blazing Grace Show. We'll see you around.
So long.
Thank you for tuning in to this edition of the Blazing Grace Show. We trust today's broadcast helps bring you closer to God and to what God desires for your life. Blazing Grace is a listener-supported mission intended to help listeners around the world. Your support is vital in keeping that mission alive. We ask you to prayerfully consider sending a tax-deductible gift to Blazing Grace. It would be gratefully appreciated. You can send your monetary gift to Blazing Grace, P.O. Box 62521, Colorado Springs, Colorado 80962-2521. That's Blazing Grace, P.O. Box 62521, Colorado Springs, Colorado 80962-2521. Want to learn more about Blazing Grace? Find us on the internet at www.blazinggrace.org. That's www.blazinggrace.org/radio.htm. On that page, you'll find a downloadable copy of this show, or you can visit oneplace.com under Ministries. Look for Blazing Grace Radio. If you want help resolving a sexual addiction, you can reach Jason Graves toll-free by dialing 877-590-SOUL. That's 877-590-7685. In addition to Jason Graves Counseling, Mike Janung has a book out. Mike Janung's book, The Road to Grace, Finding True Freedom from the Bondage of Sexual Addiction, is available at www.roadtograce.com. The book guides those who struggle with sexual addiction to a place of finding the abundant life of Christ. There are also sections for wives and recovery for marriage. Desire for a specific subject to be covered on Blazing Grace? Tell Mike Janung what you want covered. You can email Mike at blazinggrace.org. We look forward to sharing more blazing issues and grace-filled answers next time. Thanks once again for listening, and may God shine His grace upon you.